Colorado. That's fantastic. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today for the second webinar in our series on endangered sites of diversity in California. For those of you who may not know me, I am the Senior Field Director of the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Los Angeles office, and I am thrilled to be working with my partners here, the California Preservation Foundation, on this series. I cannot thank them enough for all of their help in putting this series together, as well as all of the presenters in this three-part series, which is shining a spotlight on little-known and underappreciated sites across California that tell powerful and relevant stories of diversity, inclusion, justice, and reconciliation. And today's webinar is no exception. You'll hear from our speakers today about the Harada House in Riverside, which is a nationally significant site that was witness to painful chapters in our immigration, civil rights, and Japanese American histories. And it has an incredibly important role today to play as our country continues to come to terms with its legacy of discrimination and racism. Next slide, please. But this is also an opportunity for us to feature the National Trust's 11 Most Endangered Places program. For those of you who may not be familiar with our 11 Most Endangered Places program, two of the sites in this series are actually, were featured in our 11 Most Endangered Places program in last year in 2020. The Harada House is one of them. You'll be hearing from another one if you attend the webinar next week on the 2nd. The 11 Most Endangered Places program is an advocacy program of the National Trust, but it's also a public affairs program. And so we use this to highlight both threatened places, but also the potential for high profile preservation success stories. And it's an opportunity for us to collaborate with our partners across the country to help support their needs and their goals and help expand and enrich our national preservation network. And recently, the National Trust has made a very intentional focus on sites that help tell the full American story, that highlight diverse people, places, and themes in our history. So last year, we had a very strong focus on sites associated with women's history and achievement in recognition of the 19th Amendment centenary and our new Where Women Made History campaign. Next slide, please. And here is just a handful of some of those sites. You see the Harada there, right front and center, from last year's 11 Most Endangered Places listing that had connections to women and women's achievement. And so you can see we had great representation from across the country. And it was really important for us that these all focus on ways to help address the threat. It's not just a sort of a clarion call that this place is threatened, but it's how the public can get involved and how others can help resolve the threat so that there is the potential for a positive outcome. Next slide, please. And for those of you out there who may have a threatened place in your community, our call for 2021 11 Most Endangered Sites is open right now. That will remain open through February 1st. It is very easy to apply. All the materials and information are online at these links that you see here. You also, if you're not sure if your site is eligible to be in 11 Most, you can send an email to that address, 11most@savingplaces.org, and either I or someone else on our staff will get back to you. Happy to chat with you about that. And just a note that our media announcement of the 11 Most Endangered Places this year will be in early June on June 3rd. Next slide. Actually, I think that's it. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. I've gotten to know Robyn Peterson, the director of the Museum of Riverside, fairly well over the last year. It's been a pleasure to work with her as the staff person in the city who's responsible for the future of the Harada House. And she's going to be talking with Mark Rawitsch, the author of The House on Lemon Street, Japanese Pioneers and the American Dream. So Robyn and Mark, I will turn this over to you now.
Thank you, Christine, and I will go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So it's my great pleasure, in addition to welcoming all of you in the audience today, to introduce Mark Rawitsch, author of The House on Lemon Street, Japanese Pioneers and the American Dream. The book was published by the University Press of Colorado in 2012 as the first publication in the George and Sakai Aratani Nikkei in the Americas series, developed by Lane Ryo Hirabayashi at the University of California, Los Angeles. The book was the inaugural winner of the Crater Family Book Prize in American Values in 1913. Let me just, there's the cover of the book for those of you who need to look for it in your local bookstore. And the house appears on the screen right now in its residential neighborhood where it still stands. Mark first met Sumi Harada at the Harada House in 1976 and has been involved in telling the Harada family story and helping to preserve the Harada House National Historic Landmark ever since. This is the way it stands in the neighborhood today. And Mark, I understand that you have before we get to the questions we have, could you provide a little bit of a brief version of the story of the Harada family and Harada House for our audience? You're muted, Mark.
Okay. I should be okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Mark. Yep,
Okay,
you're good.
Great. It's dangerous to ask a historian who's produced a 400-page historical narrative to do 10 or 12 minutes on the story of the book, but here goes. We'll start with the basic history of the Harada family, beginning in Japan in the late 1890s. Jukichi Harada was trained as a school teacher, and during his first teaching assignment in the late 90s, he reached the conclusion that the teaching profession in Japan would not meet his expectations for an interesting and productive life. He'd also recently met and fallen in love with the sister of one of his friends, and he and his new wife, Ken Indo, were married in 1897 when Ken was 16 and Jukichi was 22. Their marriage was a bit unconventional since it was not arranged by the older generation like many of their peers. This fact set the tone for future breaks with their Japanese past. The couple's first child, pictured here in Japan, a son named Masaatsu, was born in Japan in 1899. Jukichi had already come to America alone. He served on the West Coast patrol ship during the Spanish-American War, finding work as a helper in the ship's galley. Jukichi was later joined by mother Ken and son Masaatsu, and they settled in Riverside in 1905. Next slide, please. By 1910, 3 more children had been born. And unlike the 3 immigrant members of the family, the 3 younger children were all American citizens by virtue of the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. Native-born Americans, daughter Mine, son Tadao in the sailor suit, and daughter Sumi. Sumi was born in Riverside on Christmas Day in 1909. Next slide. Jukichi and Ken soon developed a couple of business enterprises, one a boarding house operation in rented space downtown, the other the Washington Restaurant, named by an earlier owner for George Washington, but decorated by Jukichi Harada with portraits of several other American presidents adorned with little American flags. In 1913, the state of California passed its first alien land law to prevent what was called aliens ineligible to citizenship from owning property and from establishing themselves in California. Until the mid-20th century, immigrants from China and Japan could not become naturalized US citizens. Others from Europe could many years earlier. Next slide. Just a few months after California passed the alien land law, son Tadao, the little boy in the sailor suit, died of diphtheria in the crowded downtown rooming house. Tadao's death prompted Jukichi and Ken to vow that to protect their surviving children, they would try to find a home of their own in a safer setting than a downtown rooming house. Next slide. By 1915, another son, Yoshizo, sitting next to Sumi and with the family dog here on the rattan settee, Yoshizo had been born, and at the end of the year, Jukichi spotted an ad in the local newspaper for a little house for sale on Lemon Street. Knowing about the alien land law's restrictions on property ownership by non-citizens, Jukichi bought the house and recorded ownership in the names of his 3 American citizen children, 9-year-old Mine, 6-year-old Sumi, and 2-year-old Yoshizo Harada. The house was close to the children's school and the family's church, and also smack dab in the middle of a fairly well-to-do middle-class white neighborhood. Within days of the purchase, several white neighbors formed a committee to offer the Haradas a few $100s more than they paid for the house, to give it up and move to what they viewed as a more appropriate part of town, the other side of the railroad tracks. The committee had a face-to-face meeting with Jukichi and Ken to make their offer of a buyout. And Harada told them, quote, "I won't sell. You can murder me, you can throw me into the sea, and I won't sell." He also added a second story to his new house to provide new space for his growing family. This expansion of the little house, nearly doubling its size, no doubt further alarmed the neighbors. At the same time, and because he had been, as one report later noted, quote, "roasted to a deep brown by the Riverside Real Estate Board for making the sale to the Haradas," the real estate agent who had sold the house to the Haradas wrote to the California Attorney General, Ulysses S. Webb, also the principal author of the 1913 Alien Land Law, asking if Japanese boys or girls born in California could own real estate. Webb replied fairly quickly that the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution guaranteed that citizens born in America could acquire and hold real estate. All seemed well for a moment. In another few days, news of the Harada sale was printed in William Randolph Hearst's California newspapers, claiming that the Japanese were poised to take ownership of the state's agricultural lands by evading the alien land law and recording land ownership in the names of their minor children. Probably because of the newspaper coverage and subsequent turmoil, it didn't take long for Attorney General Webb to have a change of heart. He soon filed a lawsuit on behalf of the people of California against Jukichi and his 3 minor children, claiming that they had violated the alien land law and that the state would, as a result, confiscate their house. Next slide. In addition to the neighbors who opposed the Haradas, another faction in Riverside began to come to their defense. Frank Miller, pictured here on the right, was an avid supporter of improving the relations between Japan and the United States, so much so that at the end of his life, he was awarded the Small Order of the Rising Sun by the government of Japan to acknowledge his efforts. In earlier years, Miller had even hosted a visit by President Theodore Roosevelt and later African-American educator and advocate for Black civil rights, Booker T. Washington. As a community, Riverside had been known as a relatively tolerant place compared to some. There were many Christian churches, so many that earlier Chinese residents had already called the place Ye So Fao, Jesus City. Behind the scenes, Miller offered to assist the Haradas as the case came to trial in 1918, just as the US declared war on Germany and joined World War I. When Japan was an ally of the US and Western European powers. This international situation slowed the progress of the case, since Attorney General Webb claimed that he didn't want the Harada case to cause any embarrassment to the US government. Next slide. Eventually, at the end of 1918, the Haradas won their case when Riverside Superior Court judge ruled in their favor, saying the Harada children may be, quote, of somewhat humble station, but the rights of American citizens are the same, no matter what their parentage. So the Haradas were able to keep their new house, and as I say in my book, they had no plans to ever live anywhere else. So, end of story? No. Next slide. During the 1920s and 30s, the family continued to grow and diversify. 2 more sons were born after the Haradas bought their house. They also adopted another son in the late 1920s. At the same time, oldest daughter Mine married Saburo Kido, a native of Hawaii who had just graduated from law school at the University of California, Berkeley. This is Mine and Saburo's wedding portrait in 1928, taken in Riverside. Mr. Kido would soon become one of the founders of the new Japanese American Citizens League, a second-generation group dedicated to advancing the Japanese American community. Next slide. By the late 1930s, Jukichi and Ken were in failing health, and daughter Sumi had assumed most of the responsibilities of running the family's restaurant. The other children were either completing high school or starting families of their own. Then came December 7th, 1941, when Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And the next day, President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan and the US entered World War II. Next slide. On February 3rd, 1942, Ken Harada was required to complete her alien registration, and in another 2 weeks, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which required that all Japanese, whether aliens or citizens, immediately leave new restricted military zones along the West Coast. The elder Haradas and their remaining grown children were forced to leave Riverside and into what Roosevelt himself had called concentration camps. The members of the extended Harada family ended up in 3 different camps: Poston, Arizona, Tule Lake, California, and later Topaz, Utah. Next slide. One of the Harada's longtime restaurant customers, bachelor blacksmith Jess Stebler, volunteered to live in and care for the Lemon Street house and stayed there for the duration of the war. Next slide. The disruption of the forced removal further eroded the health of both Ken and Jukichi Harada, and Ken died at the Topaz Camp Hospital in Utah in 1943. She passed just 1 day after Sumi and brothers Harold and Roy had arrived from the Poston camp to be at her bedside. Jukichi died there the following year, so they never again saw their house on Lemon Street. There are many other stories about the Harada's detention during the war years, including information about 3 of the brothers serving in the US military and 1 challenging the government's military draft. Son Harold served as a medic in the famed 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Italy. Daughter Mine's husband, Mr. Kido, had by this time become the wartime president of the Japanese American Citizens League and faced great conflict within the Japanese American community as it grappled with the idea of cooperating with the military orders of the government. Next slide. After the war, Jess Stebler moved out of the Lemon Street house and Sumi returned there alone in 1945. At the request of a local minister, Mr. Omura, Sumi opened the Harada house to several other Japanese Americans who'd lost their homes because of the forced removal. She had the 2nd-story sleeping porch at the front of the house enclosed to provide more room for her temporary residents. And after they established themselves and moved away, Sumi continued to live alone in the house for the rest of her life. She eventually found work as a housekeeper for several Riverside families, including the city's mayor. Sumi also became somewhat of a local celebrity after she and I successfully nominated her house as a local historic landmark in 1977, receiving a listing in the National Register of Historic Places soon after. In the early 1990s, a designation for Harada House as a National Historic Landmark followed, joining Frank Miller's Mission Inn as the only other NHL in Riverside. Sumi's friends in town used to tease her that she, not her house, had become the real historical landmark. Sumi died at the age of 90 in 2000, and her brother, Dr. Harold Harada, inherited the house and contents. Dr. Harada soon approached the city of Riverside through its museum department and was in the midst of arranging to donate the house and contents to the city when he passed in 2003. His heirs completed the transfer process, and for the last 17 years, the house and its extensive collections, something like 6,000 objects, 30 linear feet of archival materials, and almost everything else Sumi never threw away, have been processed and conserved by Museum of Riverside staff. A long story involving countless museum and city staff, as well as a number of historic preservation professionals and other interested community members. A significant story of its own. That's about the smallest nutshell I can put the story in. And now let's turn back to Dr. Robyn Peterson. Robyn?
It's impressive, Mark, condensing a rich story in so short a time. I do have a few questions I'd like to ask you and bringing a little bit more into the present. Many people have noted the links between the past, as we see it in the Harada story, and the present, as Americans continue to grapple with immigration, race, justice. But is there a part of the Harada story that seems particularly relevant to you today?
Well, you said it, immigration, race, and justice. I guess you could also say, you think, reevaluating the purpose and intent of Confederate monuments, the losses incurred by the Black Lives Matter situation earlier this year, what it means to be included in the American story as equal partners in the American dream. All that connects. And each passing year, the Harada House has seemed more relevant than it did when I first entered back in the 70s. are we going to continue to exclude and marginalize people or not? Another more current aspect of the relevance of the story, I think, relates to Attorney General U.S. Webb and Senator James Phelan. Phelan was the former mayor of San Francisco, and his 1920 senatorial campaign slogan in California was, quote, "Keep California white." He lost that election, but he had previously served as a senator in California for several years. Attorney General Webb was one of the longest serving attorney generals in American history. And I think if you listen closely, you can hear them turning over in their graves, because the former California Attorney General and Senator Kamala Harris just became the Vice President of the United States. So I noticed when you talk about the current relevance, I just happened to find this on CNN this morning. I'm looking at my iPhone, and it talked about the uprising at the Capitol when the Confederate flag was dragged through for all to see. And it says, quote, "The uprising, incited by an ex-president who fueled white nationalism, underscored how America's oldest fault line is also one of its freshest following last summer's national reckoning. Yet subsequent events have also left a sense that while the country has rarely been more divided since the Civil War that was fought over slavery, progress is possible and as necessary as ever."
Absolutely. Most Japanese American historic sites are significant because of their connection to the forced removal and the incarceration period during World War II. Can you comment on the different, more triumphant reasons for Harada House gaining its National Historic Landmark status?
Well, for many years after the war, and I think even up till now, school textbooks barely mention the forced removal. And those that do seem to emphasize that that was the central event of Japanese American history, and that it just materialized overnight when World War II started. I think for any topic involving diversity in America, it's critical to know the foundations for what some think just happened because of the war with Japan. So in the case of the Harada House, I think there are much deeper foundations to explain how the forced removal happened. Some Japanese American scholars have pointed out that the alien land laws, which ended up happening in Western states throughout the first 20 years of the 20th century, that those alien land laws really were intended to drive the Japanese out of California, and that the impetus for the forced removal happened because of World War II. So the restrictive immigration policies that created that climate for removal kind of echoed today's, again, unsolved immigration discussions. And I can see future historians revisiting the anti-immigrant rhetoric of today, especially depending on how all this turns out. It's an ongoing discussion, and that with any major historical event, there are always the roots preceding it that people need to have a better understanding of. And I think the Harada House gives the opportunity to discuss that whole story, from immigration through the desire of the neighbors to not have them live there, through the forced removal, and then on to other things.
So there's that dichotomy too about, in spite of the incarceration, Jukichi himself calling the United States a great country, and the conflicts within the family.
He actually said that in camp on his deathbed, basically to his daughter, Mine. Mine told me that when she was there visiting him at Topaz at the hospital, he said to her, and she was complaining about everything they were going through with the forced removal. And he said, "Despite what we're going through, don't ever forget, this is a great country."
In your, let me turn again to Sumi in front of the house. In your book, you suggest that when you first visited the house to meet Sumi 45 years ago, you felt like you had stumbled upon a place in the Twilight Zone, or King Tut's tomb of Japanese American history. And what did you mean by that?
Well, I've gone to Chico State University in Northern California, and at Chico State, I was an anthropology student working on a bachelor's in anthropology. Part of the anthropology curriculum was taking part in archaeological excavations. And we did several sites in Northern California. They were all underground. The whole purpose of the dig was to find little bits of fragments of cultural material in the dirt, and then try to use those fragments to tell the story of what had happened at those places in the past. When I went to Harada House, I was just planning to interview Sumi Harada for a couple of hours to find out about Japanese American history. I was doing a seminar paper on school grades of Japanese American students. But when I walked in the house, I was almost taken back. I really did feel like I was in the Twilight Zone. There was a 1942 calendar hanging on the wall. And there's a little notation at the top of the calendar that says left May 23rd. When I saw what was in the house, all the furniture was there, lots and lots of materials that evidently had never really been moved. Her parents' clothing was still hanging in the closets. And I asked to go upstairs and look around, and she kind of reluctantly my hair was a lot longer then, and I'm not sure Sumi really trusted me. But over the course of several additional meetings, because I thought, this is more than a 2-hour interview, Sumi took me upstairs and showed me her brother Harold's inscription on the wall. Next slide. And just before Harold left with his adopted brother Roy and Sumi to go to the Post and Relocation Center, he wrote on the bedroom wall, evacuated on May 23rd, 1942, Saturday, 7 a.m. And then he signed his middle name, Shig, for Shigetaka. Sumi had also saved things like the steamship ticket that Ken Harada held in hand when she came to America, and had never really gotten rid of anything. So the fact that she lived there by herself, she eventually ended up sleeping on a little cot downstairs and left the whole rest of the house untouched. So it's not only the structure itself, it was the collections, the materials, the material history of the family, basically, that still remained, and told a very detailed story of a Japanese American family.
And you had an opportunity to go through this in some detail with Harold, correct?
Yes, this is a photo in 2000 after Sumi passed. Her brother, dentist, Dr. Harold Harada, visited with us and museum staff at the time. We went through the house and we did a videotape tour of every room in the house with Harold. And he went through his memories of various objects and various rooms and various topics of family history, retelling the story of what it felt like to leave, retelling the story of his parents having to wait in the house while the FBI searched the house in 1943. And they went through everything top to bottom, dumping everything out on the beds to try to find what the government was calling contraband. And what they confiscated was Harold's Kodak camera and probably the boys' ROTC sword. They never saw it again after the FBI search.
So over the years that you conducted and collated your research, what struck you most on an emotional level about the Harada family story?
Oh, this one's hard to get through. The Harada story has been spoken of as a situation where ordinary people have found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. So for me as a historian and an archaeologist, lucky enough to actually meet people at an archaeological site instead of just trying to figure out what happened there, telling their story using their own voices was key to me. So I did taped interviews, I did emails, I did letters, we did lots of communication on a regular basis for a long time. And the quote from Jukichi, of course, I won't sell, you can murder me, you can throw me into the sea and I won't sell, came from the court transcript. But then there are other quotations from other family members that mean a lot to me. One is from the mother, Ken Harada, who worked dawn to dark in the Washington restaurant. She never really had a chance to do much else and worked 6 days a week usually. And Sumi told me in one of the interviews that she used to say, Ken Harada used to say, quote, "The only time I see the sun is through the kitchen window." The only time I see the sun is through the kitchen window. And that just really touches me with the dedication that Ken Harada found herself in. She also said to her husband, Jukichi, if you'd been a good boy and stayed in Japan, you'd be a principal by this time. So there's a piece of characteristic Harada direct commentary that other family members will get a kick out of, I think. Sumi's own conclusion that still fits with today. The very last thing she said in one of the interviews I did with her back in the 70s, she said, sometimes I think it's just a matter of the color of your skin. We breathe the same air and drink the same water. So I'm glad I didn't sell the place. I'm glad I had a place to come back to. It's home. There's no other place. Next slide. The other part of this long journey I've been on, it's almost 50 years by now, is getting to know the later descendants of both Ken and Jukichi Harada. This is a photo from Naomi Harada's retirement party last year in Walnut Creek. But I also have a chance to know more about the subsequent generations of the Harada family. And people have asked me, are there any descendants of Ken and Jukichi Harada? And what did they do? So besides the grandchildren who went into healthcare, the law, education, and law enforcement, there's a couple of stories from last week. Naomi visited me and Sandy here in Mendocino County last weekend, and she shared the updates of a couple of great-granddaughters that I think is worth explaining. One great-granddaughter is a registered nurse for Los Angeles County, currently caring for COVID patients. The other one was assigned to security at the Biden-Harris administration last week, serving as a deputy for the LA County Sheriff's Department. So there's an ongoing contribution of members of the Harada family to America that reminds me of the current situation of the Dreamers. And I'd like to make sure that this story resonates in that world too.
Thank you. Yeah. So I can share a few updates for the audience about the house itself and where we are with the rehabilitation efforts. It's a very complex undertaking. We've had a couple of historic preservation architectural firms analyze the house and prepare some suggested plans to move us forward. Those plans have been divided into phases, and we were fortunate enough to receive a Save America's Treasures grant last year, which is a grant program administered by the National Park Service, which allows us to begin with phase one. Phase one is going to comprise reconstructing the foundation of the house, which you can see in this image is shored up in many places by piers and beams to compensate for the fact that the house is riddled with termite damage and water damage and just general subsidence. Reconstruction of the foundations as well as some structural stabilization will comprise phase one. The Save America's Treasures grant is $500,000. It requires a 1-to-1 match. So that's your first little cue that we're still raising funds for this. The second phase will comprise more thoroughgoing stabilization of the structure itself, installing building systems, addressing accessibility for the ultimate day when we can open it to the public. And this is a view from the landing down the first flight of stairs into what's called the hair combing room. You can see this room is typical of all the rooms in the house now, where it's braced and shored in every conceivable direction to preserve the finishes and to keep things from falling even further out of square. The house is examined after every weather event, every earthquake, and in general, we do everything we can until the sufficient funds are raised to slow the pace of deterioration. Phase three, the final phase of the rehabilitation will be completing all the interior work, reconstructing and recreating finishes, roofing. Not surprisingly, the whole project will start from the bottom and work up, and we'll be doing some painstaking recreation of wallpaper. You see the state of much of it right here in this view. And then further work on the landscaping, restoring that. We have some information from Mark's book actually that tells us some of the trees and plantings that formerly were on the site that we can reinstall. And in general, this is a surprisingly costly and time-consuming undertaking. We imagine that if we had all the funding in place right now, it would still take us about 5 years to do this project. We expect it to be a little over $5 million. We are about 880,000 of the way there. That's including the Save America's Treasures grant. So as you can see, we have a ways to go, although we will be able to begin phase one in 2021. There are ways to help us, and I shamelessly promote the Harada House Foundation as a primary means, gifts directly to the City of Riverside, to the Harada Fund, or to the Riverside Museum Associates Restricted Harada Fund. So we would be delighted to take questions from the audience at this point.
Great, thank you, Robyn. John here. And while we're all sort of activating our videos and getting started here, I think I might start with a question of my own here. We had a lot of people on Facebook. And so I'll start with a question from Salvador from Facebook, who's actually asking from a broader context. He's in Monterey, California, and he was wondering on your opinion. He's talking about some sites that are associated with braceros who had accidents near Chular, California, and the other in King City, and there were sort of tragic circumstances associated. But he was wondering, how can we go about preserving and or marking such historical event sites? From your professional opinion, what you've learned in with your efforts with the Harada House.
If I understand the question correctly, he's asking how we memorialize sites that are important for negative reasons. Is that correct? So
yeah, I think he's wondering, given his own circumstances, trying to recognize and protect these sites in Monterey, what you've learned from the Harada House, maybe what you could offer him in terms of advice on how to recognize these sites.
Well, I'll ask Mark to chime on this too, but certainly what I would say is that finding a connection to contemporary experience is very helpful. You know, drawing that line from the past to the present, finding the positive and the triumphant aspects of the story can be helpful in kind of tilling the soil, so to speak, and building local support, and then connecting to wider trends in the historic stories, so that it doesn't seem so uniquely local, but it connects to wider trends, both in the state and beyond. Those would be suggestions that I could throw out there. Mark, do you have other comments?
I just add that document. Try to get as much information as possible at any of the sites, hopefully from firsthand information to start with, and of course local information from newspaper, other archival sources. So many of these stories are so fragile, and some of them, I would say probably more than half, are mostly in people's heads. They're not easily documentable. They're not in libraries. They're not in books. So you really have to know your community, and don't be afraid to ask individuals about local history and see what you can find out that way. It was common in the Japanese American community for people not to speak of the relocation experience, the forced removal. And it's only been recently, and it's with the loss, of course, of that first generation, the Issei, but the second generation, Nisei, who were the children of the relocation process, are fading fast too. No offense to anyone who still might be with us, but talk to people. And don't be afraid. A lot of historians and a lot of librarians and archivists and that sort of thing go into the field thinking they'll ever have to speak to anybody again. They think they'll spend their whole lives in a library or an archive. But with these kinds of sites, you really need to talk face to face to people in the community to understand and document.
Okay, and I'll move into a question from Beth to follow on that. She's asking specifically about the Harada family. She's asking, did the family express fear or resentment in the face of discrimination? And second part of that question is, did they receive support from the Japanese American community, and were they scorned?
Oh, it's a complicated question. The first part of whether they were threatened, there was a woman on one side of the street who said, you Jays stay on your side of the street and don't ever walk over here. Ken Harada, the mother, instructed her children to be polite but careful with any offers of food. And there's a chapter in the book called World War and a Basket of Apples, and a woman in the neighborhood offered the Harada girls a basket of, quote, lovely red apples that they had to refuse very politely because their mother was afraid they'd be poisoned. The second question, the larger Japanese American community question, at the time of the court case, there were some Japanese in Riverside who told Harada to back off and not pursue the case. There were prefectural differences. Some came from different prefectures, and Jukichi felt he was a little bit isolated from some of his compatriots, so he went ahead anyway. There's a larger story with Mine and her husband and the Japanese American Citizens League decision, very controversial at the time, to cooperate with the US government orders for the forced removal. Some people have never forgiven the JACL for being in that role during World War II, and it's a very deep, very complicated situation. One interesting sidelight, and I've got to share it, is that Saburo and Mine's daughter, Rosalind, married a man named Edison Uno. And Edison, for Bay Area people especially, but throughout the country in the Japanese American community, was one of the very first people to promote the idea of providing redress for the Japanese American community, which was successful. And the people who were assigned to the camps did receive a $20,000 check finally after those efforts were made all the way up into the 1980s. So there are lots of questions from both the local perspective and the national perspective within the Japanese American community.
Thank you for that, Mark. That's very interesting. I wanted to mention that Beth was calling in from the Historic Hawaii Foundation in Honolulu, and she had another question that's more related to how is, you talked about, Robyn, about the 5-year timeline and the money needed to reopen the site. So is the plan to make it a house museum? Is it going to be an outreach area? I'm not sure if we covered that yet.
Sure. The plan is to open the house in such a way that visitors, in very small numbers at a time, will be able to walk back in time into the house the same way that it was when Sumi walked out of it. We have the furnishings in full, as Mark mentioned, and they can be reinstalled after the house is rehabilitated. It's not our intention that it'll be a historic house museum in the sense that it'll be full of interpretive panels or anything like that. That's not going to be the case. All the interpretive material will be in Robinson House, which is next door. Robinson House is so named after Cynthia Robinson, one of the neighbors who initiated the objections to the purchase of the house by the Harada family. So that will be prepared and completed before the likely completion date of Harada House to be the interpretive center. So the experience of walking in the house will be kind of one of those time warp experiences where you see it as if the Haradas had just stepped out.
That's good. One of our audience members here, Michael, was wondering, would you be interpreting then sort of that courtroom and the press, that part of the history would be in that secondary structure that you're talking about, or the next door house, I should say?
Robinson House Interpretive Center will be an opportunity for us to tell multiple stories at different times. There won't be, again, even there won't be a fixed one and only story. It'll be an opportunity for us to explore different aspects of the Japanese American experience in Riverside and beyond, different aspects of the Harada story. There's a lot of rich material that we can develop, even that house is very tiny, so the interpretive space we'll have available to us will be small. So it's not going to look like a museum. It's going to look like a house.
It
One
was
thing
so, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Just one thing to add, the Robinson House, which is right next door, and this is a tricky thing for houses in the middle of neighborhoods full of other houses, but the museum was able to purchase that property a couple of years ago with a special fundraising effort. So they actually own the second house next door for the Interpretive Center.
That's great. That's good. Helps protect the site too, I imagine.
That was an unusual opportunity.
So I just wanted to mention that we did, Donna Graves had mentioned that she had completed a study for Riverside, the National Register of Historic Places Multiple Property Documentation Form.
Yes.
And I found the PDF online and I posted that in the chat. It's Japanese American Heritage and the Quest for Civil Rights in Riverside, California, 1890s to 1970s. I'll post that PDF link again in the chat in case anyone missed it. And then I also posted in the chat a Civil Rights in America guideline from the National Park Service about documenting and recording these kind of sites. And then I think John had another question. Do we have anything in the Q&A?
Yeah, and I'm going to take my liberty and roll in one of my own questions into somebody else's questions. So this is a two-part question here. Sarah was first asking, what was the willingness or not of the city of Riverside to take on the responsibility and cost associated with the Harada House?
The willingness was there. At the time that the house was accepted by the city, I think no one was aware of what the costs would be in a full rehabilitation. It was well known that a study would have to be done, historic structures report, which was acquired several years after the acceptance of the house. And you know, it's kind of a daunting number. It takes some time to get used to the idea that a small house will require $5 million in rehabilitation. And so the message that I've been with the city only 3 years, and the message that's been quite clear to me is that a private fundraising effort was going to be necessary to do this, that the city's municipal resources have been generous in stemming the deterioration process and the shoring and the bracing and the remedial and rescue work. But the full rehabilitation project is being pursued as a private fundraising campaign.
And to add to that, I'd like to ask about the surrounding pressures, because this is a common issue in urban or semi-urban areas of California across the state in terms of pressures of real estate, of density, of challenges to the neighborhood that surround the Harada House and other historic resources within that city. So I'm not sure if either of you or both of you could comment on these sort of issues that affect these historic resources and how it has affected the Harada House, or if at all.
Just at the very beginning, back in the late 70s, initially, there was an assumption that that whole neighborhood would be destroyed. And I did my very first article. It was printed in the Pacific Citizen newspaper, the Japanese American Citizens League. And the title was called "Redevelopment Threatens Historic Issei Home." And we did just a small version of the story to explain that in fact, urban redevelopment was assumed to soon take the neighborhood out. There's been activities since, and Robyn probably knows the story better than I do, of different historic districts with the work of people like Donna Graves, by the way. Thank you, Donna, for developing historic districts in the downtown area of Riverside. And I think now the Harada House is within one of those historic districts. Right. Robyn?
Yeah, both Robinson House and Harada House are in one of the designated historic districts. And Riverside is pretty proud of maintaining its neighborhood character. And Harada House is only about 3 blocks away from the main museum site downtown. And even downtown does not feel like a downtown. There are very few high-rises. The very strong sense of valuing the historic architectural character of the city. So we are not seeing the bulldozers at the intersection ready to move into the neighborhood. It's still a very, very residential neighborhood in character and feel, and it's expected to be that way for some time.
Great, thank you. I think Chris has a question now.
I do. Thanks, John. So I was going to, this is from Gail in the Q&A. She's wondering about the contents of the house, which I think we discussed a little bit. Like, things like that calendar, which was so compelling to see that note on that calendar. So the plan is to put these back into the house. And I guess, is that the ultimate plan? And what is and how would, or you talked about the ultimate goal for the furnishings and all. Where is everything being held in the meantime, I guess, is one question.
Everything is being kept in our secure climate controlled collection storage area for the museum as a whole. And it's been a long process to review and catalog all the material. It's still ongoing, currently occurring now with the help of some University of California, Riverside interns. But yeah, it's the intention is to put things back in the rooms they came out of. We have some documentation about that. So it's including the clothes in the closet and the contents of the drawers. So that's what we intend to do.
I've got to tell you a quick story about the calendar. It was an insurance company calendar provided by a man named Seiichiro Nagamori. And his grandson is Lance Ito, who was the judge in the O.J. Simpson trial. So there's even connections to that on another thread off into the distance.
6 degrees.
So there have been 3 questions that I'm going to roll into one as much as I'm able to. There were a few, actually one comment, which was somebody really appreciated that you rolled in mention of the Dreamers into your conversation about this history. And then there were 2 questions that were sort of about the future generations, one about students. And the question was from Erin in Facebook, and she was saying, I grew up in Riverside and never knew the history of the Haradas nor their house. What is the community doing to enlighten school-aged children about this resilient family?
The museum itself has curriculum-based teaching units, particularly for grades 3 through 6, that we're further enriching at the moment. And we're developing some digital versions of these programs. So we've recently received an invitation from the Riverside Unified School District to delve a little more deeply into this. So certainly efforts are underway to rectify that oversight from educational practices in the past.
I think Chris Morris had a question too for our panel.
Yes, I thank you, John. I just wanted to ask you, Robyn, probably for you or for Mark. We're seeing a lot of trends right now in sites that are really becoming places to bring the community together to deal with these questions of immigration, discrimination, racism, and almost as sites for healing and justice. And I can think of a couple of examples right now, like the McDonough 19 School, the Emmett Till Center, even the Sandra Day O'Connor House, which hosts sort of a site. It becomes a site for civil discourse. Do you see the Harada House and the Robinson House playing that kind of role in Riverside or for the JA community?
Absolutely. Yeah, the intention of both Robinson House and as the interpretive center and the site as a whole, small as the grounds and the sites are, we do see that as being a site for those discussions, even focused discussions and seminars on those very issues. We've a couple of times closed the street and had a block party in front of the house. We certainly would do that kind of thing again to be more inclusive of the wider community.
Mark, did you have anything to add to that?
No.
He's been rendered silent.
I know. Well, I could say I know that the family, the descendants of Jukichi and Ken Harada, also view the site that way, in a much broader vision for its use in the future. Less museum, more forum for future discussions.
Didn't you say at one point, Mark, that you had asked the question to Sumi? What do you think we should say this house? And what was her response to that?
Oh, Sumi said it was for something that's tugging at your heartstrings. That's really the only reason I would want to save the house. Her sister Mine said it was full of termites and it was creeping into the furniture and you should probably just tear it down. One more honest Harada statement. But the 2 of the brothers that I interviewed said, Clark Harada said, if I could do half as much as my dad did, I'd be proud of myself.
Thanks for that, Mark. I really want to thank both of you and Chris Morris as well for bringing us such an interesting story. And I think the series that we're doing with the National Trust really points out the importance of culturally significant sites that maybe are full of termites and it might almost fall down, but are critically important to understanding the context of a diverse community. And we have another one of these webinars next Tuesday, the same time that John and I'll be hosting with Chris Morris again. It'll be at noon next Tuesday, and it's on the Ohlone Heritage in West Berkeley, the Shell Mound in West Berkeley. And that is another site you won't want to miss. That discussion will be very exciting. And Chris Morris, did you have anything else you want to close out on?
I just want to make one more final plug for the 11 most endangered places listing. I threw that into the chat, but the deadline is February 1st. This is an incredibly powerful advocacy and public relations tool, as Robyn can attest. And I think also as our speakers next week will attest. So you've got 1 week left if you've got some sites in mind that you would like to bring some attention and assistance to. Thank you so much, Chris and John, for hosting.
Sure, thank you. All right, John, take it away.
Okay, I get to be the bad guy here and kick everybody out of the room. But before doing so, I'm going to paste something in the chat box, which will allow everybody to leave feedback about today's program and to let us know about future programs. As we mentioned, the recordings for this program will be available at facebook.com/CA Preservation and at our YouTube channel at YouTube/Cal Preservation, I think it is, Chris.
I think it's CA Preservation, John.
One of the two. So you can search California Preservation Foundation on YouTube and find the recording to this probably by the end of today's afternoon. Thank you to our panelists and thank you for your efforts with this wonderful house and everything you do for preservation. So I'm going to turn off my video and sound, but I'll leave the room open for everybody to leave their comments and to look at that link. So have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank
See you next week.
Thanks, everyone.